Greetings. Thank you very much for joining. This is a series of 3 different live streams that we're concentrating on circularity and supply chain management. Today, we will be talking about strategic sourcing, and I'm very fortunate to have 3 great panelists. And I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists to you right now. And we start with Lilla Toth-Tatai, who is a chocolate educator, and we will get into the realm of supply chains tied to chocolate, and I'm looking forward to that. Then we move on to Zsofia Nagy, who is a co-founder of BZLW in Greifensee. Lilla is in Vienna. And then lastly, we'll go ahead and close with Gregory Dunworth, who is a consumer insight manager and has tremendous experience tied to the subject of procurement. And so, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Have you joined Lilla to the group? Lilla, thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you.
And before I go ahead, there's something I'd like to go ahead and share with you. And we haven't prepared this one in advance, but you could see the slide that I'm showing on the screen. This comes directly from a document that you shared with me, and I thought it was quite interesting. Maybe we can just go ahead and bring it out a little bit more. This is a supply chain tied to cocoa, and you could see on the screen, I'll leave this one to you, Lilla, but I think it was very interesting to go ahead and get our conversation started with this. So based upon, let me go ahead and keep this on the screen. Based upon what you're seeing here, I thought it was quite interesting that you have millions of farmers over on the left-hand side, and then you go through this entire process, and then you have billions of consumers. So we go from millions to billions of consumers, but this is all very linear. And so the question I would have is, do any of these millions of farmers that are producing the cocoa, do they get any of the chocolate at the end? Maybe not, could be for Christmas or maybe Easter Bunny, I'm not quite sure. Do they ever get it at all?
Not really, no. And most of them don't even know what product is created from those fruits and beans that they are working with day by day. So a lot of them don't even know that it's gonna turn into chocolate. Some of them think it's made into wine, or they just don't even care about what happens to the beans once they're leaving the farm.
So that would mean that if we're talking about the end product, then not only do they not have a clue as to what is actually being produced, they would maybe struggle in actually working with it or being accustomed to it, even using it, perhaps?
Yeah, they don't know what happens after the beans leave the plantation. And we're talking about the big, like the 90% of the production of cocoa, because there's this other area, the craft chocolate movement, who are trying to be more in a direct contact with the farms. Then obviously lots of them, when they visit farms, they will bring back chocolate that was made from those beans, and that's always a very nice moment when they can actually share the real fruits of their work, of their hard work. But for most farmers that never happens, which is quite sad.
Yeah, it is, and especially because within circularity, we are always talking about closed loops. So the idea would be anything that we're actually taking from nature that we're able to bring it back. Well, based upon this construction, it makes it very, very difficult. Are there any possibilities of us trying to create closed loops within this environment?
There are some examples where the farmers can start making their own chocolate, so that the whole process will stay on the farm, and then they can sell their chocolate made from their own cocoa. But that's really rare, because most of the time there's no infrastructure, or they don't know how to make it, they don't have the knowledge or the skills, they don't have the machines. And also because it's in a hot climate most of the time, it's quite a challenge to have like air conditioning or such things that would make it possible. There are a few examples, but very few.
And of course, this only being one of the challenges that we have within sourcing, looking at it from a closed loop, but obviously there are all the ESG components, the environmental, societal, and governmental elements. And I thought it was quite interesting, this document that you shared with me. Thank you very much for that as well. We think about certain standards that are commonly applied, tied to a commodity like cocoa beans. And I thought it was very interesting in this document, some of the things that we think that these standards or these certifications are ironclad, but when you dig beneath the surface, you find out that there are quite a number of situations where these standards are not being adhered to. Perhaps if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the standards are not just not adhered to, but they're not clear. So if a company states that our chocolate is this much sustainable, or we can trace 50% of our cocoa back to the farms, traceability or sustainability means different things for the different companies. There's no clear definition of what they need to achieve in order to say that we are sustainable or we can trace our cocoa. So that's another problem. That's there's huge claims. If you Google sustainable cocoa, on the first page you will only find the big chocolate companies' sustainability programs and claims, and you will not see these more detailed and independent reports about the real state of sustainability in cocoa, which is in quite a bad state actually. So it's not sustainable at all.
Well, obviously, we want to leave people with a positive message. Do you have any ideas of what you think we should actually do to go ahead and correct that?
Well, there's the craft chocolate movement, as I mentioned, which is all the small chocolate makers, micro batch makers. They make up only about 5% of the total chocolate production in the world. But they do have lots of really good things that they do, planting a tree for each bar sold, or running different school meal programs with the farms that they work with. There's lots of examples. There's also companies who, well, most of them share their transparency reports on their website. Some of them, I have one bar which they have the transparency report inside the packaging. So if you buy a bar, then you can read how much they paid for a kilo of beans compared to the fair trade price or compared to the commodity price. So they're really trying to make sure that it's full transparency and that they have direct contact with the farm. So there's no middleman, no other people, intermediaries in between who would take the money or to interfere within the system. So that's direct trade is one of the things that these craft makers do differently. And I think that makes a small change because there are not too many of them. But if the big companies would kind of really do what they are saying that they are doing, that would help, because they have obviously the more money to do that.
And I thought it was also interesting in this report you talked about, of course, the elements that are very important when we're talking about our overall welfare, that being human rights and the living wages and the like. What are your feelings for us as being consumers? What kind of power could we possibly have vis-a-vis these larger organizations to maybe get some of these things corrected?
I think we vote with our money. So if you buy a different brand because you realize that the brand you were buying until now is not meeting these principles, or if you see that maybe they claim that they are transparent, but if you read through their actual data, then you can find out that it's just nice big claims, but you don't really know what's behind. What I suggest to people who I talk about chocolate too is that first of all, it's always about taste. But then, if you are interested in climate change or in the um, economic side or environmental side, then ask. Uh, and you will see that the big companies won't necessarily reply or won't necessarily take into consideration the consumer questions. Or if you ask a small maker, they are more than happy to show you their reports or tell you about the farms they work with. They're really proud to work with these farms,
Mm.
and they are happy to show what they do behind the scenes, whereas the big companies won't necessarily do that. So I'd say just look around, because there's lots of these little tiny companies who actually make a difference. And if we promote them, or if we buy their chocolates, not only we get nicer chocolate because it does taste much better,
Mm.
but also we can contribute to a better state at the farm level as well.
I think you came up with a very clear call to action. I think it's a call to action to all of you out there, that basically you should look for those chocolates that include the transparency report, no additional cost. And in fact, if we can actually go ahead and look at that as being a model, striving towards transparency, then if the big players were able to do the same thing, then they wouldn't be able to get away with the fairy tales, which are basically these sustainability reports sometimes.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Well then, Lilla, thank you very much. If I can go ahead and put you into our VIP lounge we have, and then I will call you back out when we are ready to go ahead and start with the panel discussion. And just as a note to all of you out there, please feel free to go ahead and use the chat box anytime during the presentations. What the goal is make this as interactive as possible, and I will do my best to go through the questions and make sure that your name ends up in lights, and that we're able to go ahead and make this truly an interactive affair. Again, Lily, thank you very much. And with that, move on to Zsofia. Zsofia, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and, oh, you're off mute, great. And I'd like to go ahead and share a slide with you as well. And we had a brief conversation. Let me go ahead and pull this up. We had a brief conversation. Actually, we've had a number of not too brief conversations. That's another story. But it's all tied to this question of standards. And I think that certainly what Lilla was talking about directly tied to what the smaller players are doing out of conviction, what the bigger players should be doing, but they're not compelled to do it. That really does bring us to this question of standards. So I know that you've been dealing with a number of corporates. Perhaps if you could describe from your perspective, this whole idea we're using ISO 2400 as an example,
yeah.
Right? But we know that this is also partially a fairy tale, because this is not very much deployed, right? That's what I understood. Perhaps if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. And in that sense, I think you did hit the nail right in the head with Lilla, from a smaller producer versus a bigger company perspective. Because as much as I believe that people try to do the best thing that you can do from a sustainability perspective, but they also get orders from their line managers, right? So there, I believe the bigger companies have this very convenient situation of sometimes hiding themselves behind legislations and paperwork and audit papers that are in many cases, just to give you a good example, as part of how the big companies outsourced, some of these assessment or audit processes. They also rely on other companies to do this work for them, right? So the whole contracting and enforcing of the standards that are available either via soft law or hard law or legislation, they are really complex by now. And in that sense, I would say it's also a problem that many of the corporations in supply chain specifically, they downscaled on personnel and how many people they employ in strategic sourcing as well as procurement. Sometimes they just don't have the time to look up and also to order an audit, right? So they rely on companies who do certifications and audits themselves. And I believe that there we have a good chance to hold those companies a little bit more accountable for what they are doing and how they are certifying, either on behalf of a bigger corporation or the bigger corporation itself with the employees that they have on board in sourcing.
Great, thank you very much for that one, Zsofia. When I think of this concept of sourcing or procurement, the typical model is actually very linear. In other words, you are asked to go ahead and purchase something, you receive the request from some department, putting on a very high level, right? And
Yes.
you go ahead and perform your due diligence, usually using price as the basic parameter,
Exactly.
but not necessarily exclusively. And with that, you more or less cross it off your list. But of course, we know within this concept of circularity that we need to be very cognizant of the decisions that we're making at the time of purchase, because we have a certain responsibility for those goods and bringing them back into the system. Otherwise, all this talk about sustainability is bunk. I'd be curious on your opinion on that one.
I can only concur what you say. I would give you two really good example where I feel that all of those who work in corporate environment could do much more. One is really where they work in sourcing, especially strategic sourcing. As you mentioned, when it comes to supplier selection or even any kind of service provider selection, just really question within the company if they are following, sustainable or even circular principles and legislation that is already available, right? So we went from a really soft set of legislation in the last 2 decades to getting quite hard to quite hard legislation in some of the countries and also globally by now. So I think this year also showed us, right, that we cannot really hide anymore. More and more people opt for products that Lilla also mentioned from a chocolate perspective, and other parts of the consumer behavior have changed. So if someone is incorporated, then really they need to also educate themselves and step up as individuals and challenge even their senior leadership to add these things if they don't see that happening. And of course, on top of that, if they are tasked with auditing any of the suppliers or just the value chain itself, which is another big issue that I see in many of the globalized supply chains, that it simply doesn't happen. They don't have the time. Some of them don't even know their own value chain properly, let's face it. So a lot of companies have a long way to go to actually know what they are doing. And I'm sorry to put it this way, but this is personal experience based on a lot of years, and I don't really see that improving by a mile at the moment. So I would urge people to really look at the total value chain end to end and look out for these standards and really start working accordingly. Of course, it's a lot of work, but at the same time, I think it's also partially how we're going to get here, right? So, of course, we need governmental and top management engagement and push to make these things happen. It's a huge box of engagement and collaboration between all of the parties. But we as individuals who are working in the supply chain or different parts of the supply chain, especially sourcing, we need to do our part.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And that's a great segue to this question that came through from Marian, where he asked, what would be the incentives for producers to be more sustainable in their sourcing?
Yes, there would be also, right? So, of course, as we all know, price is king, right? And in many ways, we went down that route of the cheaper, the better kind of attitude in all parts of our lives and supply chains. But for instance, if a producer is really able to show that they are completely sustainable or they have set up a circular value chain for what they are doing, that can be really, from a consumer perspective, a value add that the consumers are looking for. Therefore, they can put, not even a price premium, I would say a fair price that can cover really the cost, that fair cost of living and managing that business, right? So I would say that that should be a direct incentive from a consumer perspective. So again, if I take a look at corporate, yes, there could be a corporate incentive as well. If it's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years, I would be surprised, but you never know. But I think as much as consumers started digging deeper into what they are getting partially on their table or clothes and everything, we're going to get there. And I think that kind of pressure can also put enough pressure on the corporations to move in that direction, to provide incentives for producers.
Yeah, I personally think that also if we're looking at the efficiency tied to specific resources, knowing full well that because companies have not been compelled to think this way and understanding the actual waste, which is to be found within the organizations, that we have a huge potential tied to the use of that of what we actually have, making sure that we're working with primary resources. The problem really hits us when we start looking at these secondary resources, because that's when we have problems taking them apart. So if we, and I personally believe that this is part of that procurement process or the sourcing process, if we make sure that we're working with primary resources, knowing full well through the entire chain, that actually it ends up becoming much cheaper because we're able to go ahead and manage our resources much more wisely. And of course, apart from the fact of the total cost. But there are all kinds of things I think we can actually do along these lines, right?
Absolutely, and just wanted to add to this, Mike, I really appreciate you taking up on that angle. What I also mentioned a number of times to my fellow colleagues already, if we change, some of the pricing strategies from producers as well, and we took a really end-to-end pricing strategy, including, the waste management angle and how we really manage the second life or third life of that product, then we would end up with a very different pricing, to be quite honest. And PET and all the plastic materials would not be as cheap as they seem to be based on simply the oil pricing, for instance, right? So that's for me, that would be a very critical change that would need to happen from a business model perspective, to take really a full end-to-end look at the chain and price things, primary and tertiary or secondary materials accordingly. Fully agreed.
I have the sneaky feeling that this is a subject that we're probably going to cover a little bit more in detail tomorrow. Just for those of you who are watching, both Zsofia and I will be talking about the damage or the difficulties tied to the global supply chains, and we'll go into detail and looking at what kind of harm is caused. But we're hoping to go into some details as to those things that are usually not talked about. And I truly believe that we'll get into the subject of total cost of ownership there. All right. Well,
Absolutely.
then, Zsofia, thank you very much. If I can go ahead and send you back to the VIP room, and I'll bring you back out when it's time for our panel discussion. Thank you very much. And let me go ahead and introduce Gregory Donworth. Greg, thank you very much. And I have a slide to go ahead and share with you, and I think that you might be familiar with this model. Let me go ahead and share it. I think you've seen this one once or twice, if I'm not mistaken. Our subject is sourcing, and I think that first of all, it might be good for us to just briefly describe what we're looking at, this donut economy. And I'm going to give you a brief description from my side and then hand it over to you. The idea is that we live within the donut, that we make sure that we take care of the human components, which is the hole in the middle, and then the outside layer is covering the environmental. And so I think that there are certain tasks that we have tied to whatever our assignments may be, that are directly related to helping us get to that donut. And I'd be curious to get your opinion on this subject.
Yeah, so far, thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I think that that's like a fantastic graph. And the very sad thing is we are underperforming in the social, and we're definitely over polluting in the environmental. So in certain areas of the world, we're definitely doing better than others, but overall, improvements need to be made on both sides. But I definitely think when I started becoming very interested in the circular economic field and the donut economic field, I immediately thought of it as like waste reduction as the primary like aspect of it, but I quickly realized that that was a very short-sighted approach. When you think about donut economics, it's sourcing, it's transportation, it's the practices in fair trade. It's like there's hundreds and hundreds of different components that make a product like donut worthy. And when it comes to like big businesses and procurement, we have a lot of steps that need to be taken to get us to where we need to be. So I'm very happy to be a part of this panel, and yeah.
And you know, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because there was in our discussions that we had prior to this live stream today, and I have to go ahead and read my notes. You talked about going from a net zero, from zero waste to net zero lifetime emissions. I thought that was really powerful, and I could imagine what we're referring to, and actually just making sure that we're not wasteful, but actually understanding what kind of imprint we're making due to our various actions. And I'd be curious if you can correct me if I got that one wrong or not. That was my interpretation. And then I would be really keen, looking at it from a sourcing perspective, how do you think we can actually go ahead and manage that? What role does sourcing actually play within that constellation?
Yeah, great question. So basically, large organizations source what people buy. So we need to have a major consumer behavior change to make it so corporations start to procure in this new circular economic way. Since the 1950s or 60s, once plastic started to become an ever important part of our lives, the big businesses have put it on consumers to bear the brunt of the waste. They have created the modern day recycling programs are basically from CPG companies. And that was sort of the way to say, we're creating the waste, but it's the consumers that are buying it and they should be the ones dealing with it. So there needs to be a major behavior change for individuals to take those extra steps that are necessary to start procuring in a way which is much more circular, much less waste producing, much more local, whatever the metrics are that you were focused on. We need to focus on all of the metrics long term. But when we start to really change consumer behavior, hopefully more and more of these product options are going to become available. And hopefully once the trends really start to move in that direction, we can influence the large parties to start procuring in the most sustainable ways.
And this is almost a chicken and the egg question then, based upon that of what you said. So which one comes first? I don't know if you can come up with a definitive answer, but the fact is, if we're again looking at it from a sourcing perspective, knowing full well, if we take it purely from a behavioral economics perspective, understanding that we hold a responsibility as being corporations, then what do you think the role is of the sourcing department to go ahead and influence it? Do you see that they have a role? And if so, what would it be?
Absolutely. If you walk into a grocery store and there are 10 options and 5 of them are sustainable and 5 of them are not, we're not going to convince 100% of the people to go towards the sustainable options. But if we can start to make it so we trickle consumers towards the sustainable options, we'll at least begin to move the lever. So I think it should start with sustainable procurement of these options to make it so consumers can begin to make the right decisions. And we're starting to move in that direction now. Definitely more work needs to be done across the board. But I think it begins with that. It also comes down to post product life services that can make it so everything that we are purchasing can be responsibly recycled. But the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycle's the worst one of them all. That's really clear nowadays. Some countries do it better than others. In the US, we have a lot of work to do to make recycling what it should be. So we need to put a lot more work into those post-life options for these products. So in my opinion, yes, it begins with procurement. We need to start making it so more sustainable options are on the table for consumers to be able to purchase them, shift some consumer purchasing behavior in that direction, but then also making it so for those consumers who don't make those decisions out of price, out of convenience, whatever it may be, that we can at least make it so they're able to dispose of the products in reasonable ways.
You got me thinking about something. When we look at these, either let's call it ESG or whatever the standards that we might have within the corporation, and of course, if we see them as being important, then they have to be part of the CEO's responsibility, right? What role do you see procurement being there in ensuring that we have, on the one hand, that we're adhering to something that should theoretically be part of our strategy, right? And what could be the objectives from a procurement perspective so that we ensure that ESG is actually part of the procurement?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it should start. So I work in the insights department. So I'm the one that basically decides what consumers like. And I think that we play a large role, and we should be the ones influencing procurement. If the research that insights departments do is leading towards our customers want more sustainable purchasing, the CEO is going to know that. The purchasing department is going to use the insights that we generate to influence their purchasing decisions. And going towards these environmental, social standards, I think that it always comes down to, if your consumers are totally satisfied with the way you're doing things, and you're doing things in a way that isn't sustainable, and it's cheap, and you're making good margins, it's going to be hard to influence the company to go the expensive route, to go away from the way that the consumers like it currently. So I think it comes down to education from the consumer's perspective. It comes down to creating options. It comes down to measuring satisfaction and figuring and testing different hypotheses you have about how can we start to influence more sustainable practices among our consumer base. And the CEO is going to be respondent of all of those things. So I think that, yeah, I didn't want to bring it to my department because I know we're talking about procurement, but I think that the insights departments in organizations and market research departments can do a lot to really push the needle towards sustainability.
Well, I think following that of what you were saying, that of course these other departments do have the possibility of adding this as a requirement, because obviously they're going to have their own strategic objectives that they need to meet. And so if indeed they can go ahead and pass them on to procurement to make sure that it's done right in the beginning, then theoretically, wouldn't it make it better for the departments that are actually dealing with the goods at the end?
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with that. I think when it comes to procuring like zero waste products, and I'm sorry, this is a bit off of the question that you just asked, but I feel like when you talk about procuring zero waste, zero carbon emission products, there's a lot of like opportunities for innovation that need to start happening. Like I love the chocolate example of all of the listed transparency of how it was created. Now consumers and the whole world is basically incredibly used to using QR codes. So you can take up less space on all of packaging and perhaps shrink the packaging, make it more single stream packaging rather than like multiple different types of materials going into it. So it can be more responsibly recycled. That has all that traceability and everything built in. And I think like the whole purpose of procurement is, if you buy in bulk, typically prices go down. So when you buy in responsible, sustainable formats, there should be less packaging. There should be larger quantities. There should be better margins. But there are more costs associated with like the environmental sourcing practices, like making sure it's fair trade and everything like that. But once these corporations start to put their purchasing power towards these different sustainability goals, hopefully we can see a reduction in price across the board.
Great. I'd like to go ahead and bring the other panelists back, because I think that it would be very interesting to go ahead and explore this idea perhaps a little bit further and get Lilla's and Zsofia's opinion on the subject, and that would be tied to the role that other departments play within the organization. I think, Zsofia, really going back to this corporate thing, right? Where we are able to go ahead and say, we have our objectives, we have our strategic objectives we need to go ahead and reach, and we have the right to go ahead and ask these things from procurement so that they don't always use the same metrics that they always use, and that we make sure that through these metrics we're able to go ahead and reach sustainability. What are your thoughts on that? Sophie, you want to give it a go?
Yeah, I can only agree with you, Greg and Mike. This is really something that can work even in a corporate setting. But I would also point a little bit back to procurement as well, because either way, I have seen really good examples where procurement actually stepped up. They have come up with a sustainable or even circular solution. I can give you a really good example. I don't want to mention one of the big corporations. They are dealing with toothbrushes, right? And they have went from completely plastic to also offering next to their plastic range a set of bamboo toothbrushes, and also the bristles that you brush the teeth with, they are completely sustainable. And did they go a long way out to try out this option? No, but they have created an opportunity within that bigger corporation, and maybe it was a push from marketing. I don't know at the moment, but I know for a reason that we have done already experimental projects on this element, and well, it shows that sustainable and circular solutions are not always more expensive than the non-circular ones. I can testify that it's actually cheaper, and it sometimes doesn't even come with volume, as Greg mentioned. Sometimes it's just a matter of that initial investment of overhead, where you actually audit properly and check what's going on with the suppliers, and that's a one-off cost. And then on the long term, in your baseline, it doesn't show because it's even cheaper than the crappy old solution that they had. So, yeah, I can only confirm that. Can concur, absolutely.
Yeah, Lilla, and that model that we had looked at in the beginning, it was quite interesting that you had a bunch of different layers of players that are involved, but there were some other options that were also included, one that would be perhaps a little bit more direct. Do you see any alignment tied to this idea that we can perhaps do it different, not necessarily doing it the same way that we've always done it? And actually, when we do it this way, we find out that it's not more expensive. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a bit different, I think, with chocolate, because if you look at a price of a commercial chocolate bar, I don't know, maybe €1, $1, whatever, and if you think about how much actually gets back to the farm level, is less than 1%, and half of the price is just the retail margin, and it's still a cheap chocolate. So the problem with chocolate is actually that it's way too cheap to be able to become sustainable. So the price has to be higher. And that's why craft chocolate is much more expensive. A bar can cost maybe $6 to $10 or even more. And still that doesn't really cover all the costs, and even with all the premiums that these makers pay to the farmers, which is higher than the fair trade price as well most of the time, it still doesn't make it 100% sustainable, or doesn't help 100% to make sure the living wage is attained, or so it's still a long way to go, even in the craft chocolate scene. But if we look at the big companies, the pricing is not right. So unfortunately, in this case, it has to be more expensive.
Whoa, Greg, I think this is a donut economy question, isn't it? How do we go ahead and manage this part, understanding all too well that the middle of the donut hole, is exactly what Lilla is talking about?
Yeah, and I'm sure with the cheaper products as well, they are negatively impacting the environment. So I'm sure it's once again on both sides of the donut that we're falling short of where we need to be.
Oh, yeah. And then, of course, the questions, we're talking about cocoa in this particular case, but we know that cocoa is only one commodity of where this is playing out, where we have Groundhog Day on a number of commodities. And so the real question I would pose, and I don't expect you to have all the answers, so I've been trying to drum up the conversation. But the point is, isn't this something that we should really look upon if we're trying to go ahead and solve the problem of the donut? And then the question is, how do we go ahead and make it inclusive, that people understand that if we're ever going to get the donut to work, then we need to make sure that people have living wages?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is making so more people are aware of the donut. We still follow the GDP basically in most developed countries, I believe. I mean, I'm probably wrong with that, but most places follow the GDP still. So that's a really one-sided approach for economic growth. When if we just make it so more people are aware of how the donut works, like that we can still see growth while making sure that our people and our planet are protected. I think like that's the very first step, because I don't think most government officials are quite aware of this terminology yet. It's definitely happening in some places, like in Amsterdam and in Vienna. They're definitely taking more steps than they are in a lot of other places around the world. But understanding it is the very first step. And then when it comes to like procurement practicing and making sure that our procurement is happening within the donut, I just don't think that we should leave it to corporations to quantify if they're in the donut or not. Like, we should have metrics and standards that say that they are or they're not. I think we need to have like maybe not government body approval, but some way to say like, yes, this is within range, this is not within range, so we can have like a standardized agreement across the board.
Zsofia, I'm sure you have something to add to that one.
Well, I can only say that, you know, from an educational perspective, I'm quite strong on that opinion that we really need to also go back. And I think, Greg, you mentioned that as well, and Lilla as well, even Mike, you too, that we need to start with educating our own kids and our own society. And it's really important to get the donut economy message across, as well as how we are earning our wages, right? So I believe in many households, this kind of conversation doesn't even come up at the moment. And it would be really good to understand, you know, for the kids, how much they need to work, or the parents, how much they work. And I'm going in a different direction, but it's more about education and understanding of these principles, and that things just don't come for free, right? So money does not fall off the trees, and the cocoa also comes at a price, right? So there are things going into that production. So understanding these value chains from an early age is really important. And at the same time, as Greg, you mentioned, I really, really appreciate, because I also believe in that external auditing or certification body, because otherwise, from a governmental perspective, because otherwise corporations will never be, forced to take action. So if we push these two angles, that would put enough stress and pressure on the corporations to change. And they are basically over 80% of the global economy, right? Those huge corporations. So we really need to push them to take action.
There was a live stream I watched today, and it was tied to blockchain, and I thought it was very, very interesting. And I'm only using it as an example to show exactly that certification part, how it could be done. If we look at the typical process being an input, process, output, and of course we cannot go ahead and say if we have the same input or the same components in the input, that we're automatically going to have the same components at the output after the process. And regardless of whatever might be stated by those parties involved, getting back to making sure that the prisoner is going to keep the jail safe. What they've actually introduced is this ability to offer some sort of certification from a third party that would be added as a property within the entity in the blockchain, which would enable you to actually go ahead and say, you don't have to think about it, this part's been covered. So the real question would be, how can we go ahead and cover that? I think that it leads to one of the questions we just came up with from Tony, who asked, could a comparison be made between the booming US stock market while unemployment remains high and economic divide continues, and the circulation economy donut metric versus following the GDP? I'm going to go ahead and try to encapsulate that. I think it's a very good question. It really gets back, Greg, to what you were talking about, if I understood correctly. So what is this metric we use, this GDP, and to what degree does it lead to all these other points that Tony's actually talking about?
Yeah, so I'm not a stock market expert. I don't know why it's going up when I'm assuming our GDP hasn't gone up in the past 9 months at this point. So I'm not able to touch on that aspect of it, but I'll just speculate that I believe if we were to really integrate a donut model in the way that our government makes decisions, that it would be very drastic, that like we shouldn't just focus on a rising stock market because that helps the 1% or the top 10%, whatever, however many people that are like actually saving in and invested into the stock market, but we're leaving the other huge percentage of people behind. So unfortunately, I'm not able to touch on like the stock
not
market.
Not a problem. Zsofia, Lilla, you like to give a stab?
I can also give just a really short opinion, and not even opinion, just a reflection from my end, as I'm also not a stock market expert, but I know from a corporate perspective that, of course, if we really take a look at the news, some of the headlines from a US perspective are still on, offshoring and outsourcing to different other parts of the world, even during the pandemic. So roughly around in a few months, roughly 50,000 people have lost their job in the US in the manufacturing industry. So that tendency is still, adding to the heap, I believe, that you just mentioned, Tony. And in that sense, also, those people who need to leave their jobs in a manufacturing environment, they usually change to a lower paid job, partially because they need to reskill. So they enter a different part of the economy and the workplace. So there they are the net losers of the change, right, from an economic perspective, while the gain is on the shareholders side in the business. So therefore that fuels the stock market part of the equation. So that's just my basic economic explanation from a corporate perspective, knowing how those finances work. It's a sad thing, I believe. And I do believe as well that there is a different solution, as Greg said as well. If we really follow the donut economy, then there are solutions and business models with the rightful, more localized community ownership of those companies where the work and the decisions get done right. So we just need to re-explore those models that we used to have, and they were working, and that would get us closer back to a more sustainable living for everybody.
And of course, we haven't talked about green bonds. I figured that was the subject for another show. But I'm gonna go ahead and give this one a stab. I'm gonna try to come up with a meat and potatoes answer. I think part of the problem is you cannot make money in putting money in the bank. So you think, well, how am I going to make some money? So the stock market has been a vehicle that has taken us in this direction. And I think part of the problem is that instead of we keep thinking about quick returns, meaning that we don't, on the one hand, we're not interested in investing in the short and the medium term, which is clearly needed for reaching circularity if we're concentrating on the donut economy, that being one. And then, of course, the idea is, well, we have this cash, we might as well go ahead and spend it and try to come up with the best returns we can. We see how the stock market is exploding. That means we're so far removed from reality because we have so much cash floating around, although obviously we're talking about inequality because there are a number of people, going back to Zsofia, to what you were saying, a lot of people don't have that kind of have that kind of cash. And so for me, this is just pure speculation that's taking place. And eventually, following the law of physics, what goes up must come down. And it's just a really question of time. And I keep thinking, when is this going to happen? And when are we able to come up with metrics? And this is really the point. When are we able to come up with metrics that get away from the speculation? That would be my main wish, and I will give you all the opportunity to go ahead and make your own wishes, but I'd like to go ahead and address some of the questions that have come through. This is coming from Michel Praga, where he's asking to help the private sector. Is decentralizing the ESG or sustainability in corporates an option? We seem to have impact of people in these functions. Can we co-create impact bottom up through these functions? Any thoughts from anyone?
I think we can. As I was partially, the owner of this corporate angle, I think we can. The question for me really is, how do we change the corporate incentives in the companies top down to make that bottom up change in terms of mentality and ownership, getting to get back that kind of ownership mentality into corporate positions, right? So I did not talk a lot about this, but of course we went from quite a strong ownership in the early 50s or 60s, where companies were not so huge, and then we ended up with quite a decentralized and complex supply chain and sourcing models where the ownership is diminishing by the individual, right, who actually does the job. So there, that ownership attitude can be put back in place with the right incentives. Those are the things we need to discuss with the key top-level stakeholders in corporations.
Lilla, Greg, any thoughts on this?
Please.
All right, I'll go ahead and give my 2 cents. I think part of the problem is that we have departments that are responsible for it. And this might sound funny, but the real problem is because we have a department who's responsible for it, that means I'm not responsible. So what we need to do is go ahead and change the framework, and we need to make sure that everybody's responsible. And I'm directly relating to what Michael is asking here. If we go ahead and say that all of these points, all these things that we're talking about, that everybody within the organization is responsible for managing, then we don't need a department, do we? Your thoughts? Lilla, you're smiling. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I don't have much insight into how the big chocolate companies are working, or other companies, but I'm
Sure.
more focused on chocolate. But in the small companies, it really works like that. So most of them are family businesses, or like very small businesses with maybe 10, 15 people working. They are all part of it. And there's a nice reference from one of the actually American craft makers, Eskinosi, who turned chocolate maker from being attorney. And he talks about kinship. So for him, everybody in the business is like brothers and sisters. They all work together, and they have the same principles, the same values. They share values, and the customers are also within this kinship. That's what he talks about in his book. So I think including even the customers within the decisions would be an interesting way of changing this.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much for that. Okay.
I would just like to add
Please
one thing.
do, Greg.
I think it's really important, from a corporate perspective, to start quantifying everything about the environmental impact that you're having. If you have like a really easy to use tool that shows the carbon impact that you're having and where it's coming from, then it makes it so each individual department might be able to look and say, like, oh, I work in this field quite a bit, like I might be able to have an impact there. So right now, it's really difficult, in my opinion, to get corporate environmental impact statements that are understandable and easy to use. So starting with something like that would make it so you could actually see, like, oh, if I do this, I could actually have a direct impact on the environmental footprint of my company.
Everybody needs a how-to manual, right? So that's really the key. Okay. I think we are reaching the end of our allotted time. And so what I would like to do is give you all the opportunity of making one wish. Christmas is coming up, so I'm trying to go ahead and speed up the process and give you one wish. Well, we're already in Advent here in Europe, so we can go ahead and play Christkind. I'm going to give you all one wish specifically tied to what you would wish that the procurement department might be able to be empowered with to go ahead and reach these goals of circularity, or be it the the donut economy. So Lilla, I'm going to give you the first tips of your wish of what you would like procurement to have to go ahead and reach that.
Oh, it's a good question. Thank you.
You don't get it every day, I know.
I would. Okay. I wish that they understand that consumer education is key in order to change things within the system, and that more people start to know about where their food is coming from and who is making that food for them.
Sounds good. I think that's a very noble wish. Greg, how about you?
I would say updated government regulations which incentivize the purchasing of sustainable products over non-sustainable products. There's this, like the first step in habit formation is called the trigger, where you need like something to happen in order to make it so you start doing something else. So government regulations and the government in general can be that trigger to make it so we start acting in more sustainable ways. So I think updated regulations that incentivizes it, or at least like helps to even out the cost difference that may happen, especially at the beginning, before the bulkness comes in and starts to lower with increasing demand.
Okay, maybe you might have a little bit more hope on that one that come January 20th. Lead the last one to you, Zsofia. What would be that wish that you would like to go ahead and have happen?
Oh, I'm going to be really bold here. I wish, people in procurement and sourcing organizations would be a bit more ballsy and would step up a little bit more, even if it means that they sometimes need to say no to their seniors or educate their seniors. Even if it comes to that, I really find it important and to speak up, right? So if they see something not happening according to what the company says they should be doing, I know it's a really risky area, and I understand, every person who comes from an angle that they say, look, this is just too risky for me. But I wish that, we would step up on that part of the donut economy where people feel safe at the workplace to speak up and correct those processes that really don't fulfill, the donut economy principles and requirements. So that also needs to happen. So yeah, risky one, but that would be my wish to just to add to that pile that is already on that huge wish list.